Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Reynolds. I'm a project manager with Friends for Survival. And today we are honored to have Rick Knapp and David Pincus join us. They are the authors of a book. The name of the book is Sons of Suicide, a Memoir of Friendship. So David and Rick have been friends for over 53 years. And they met quite accidentally in high school when they were 17 years old. And within weeks, they became fast friends, a lot of things in common. But what helped along their friendship considerably was the remarkable discovery that they shared the same secret. And that secret is that their mothers took their lives when they were young teenagers. So we're going to chat with Rick and David, but next I'd like to introduce Marilyn Koenig. She is our Executive Director at Friends for Survival. Hello, Marilyn. How are you today?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah. Well, or afternoon, whatever.
It is afternoon.
Good day.
We're casual here. I first met Rick and David at an AAS conference in Denver in April of 2019. And I saw them on the schedule and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. A new book, men writing books about their mom dying by suicide. I knew from my experience that that was a kind of a rare thing. So I thought, I've got to go and listen to these two guys and see what they've got to say. So I did sit in on their workshop and went up and talked to them later, and we've developed a friendship, and they've been getting our materials from Friends for Survival ever since that day, I think, or shortly thereafter.
Right.
So we are delighted to have both of you here today. Your book is intriguing. It is full of such good information for people. And it is a book. Men rarely write books about losing child or losing a parent. And they certainly don't do it like 40, 50 years later. There's only a couple books that I know of that even come close to that. But this is a unique story, and your friendship is a unique story. So how about each of you want to please share the story, about your moms, what your age was at the time, what you were told. And so let's start with David.
Okay. Thank you, Susan and Marilyn, for having us. Marilyn got me thinking again about when we met and when we first shared our story publicly. We were both had sweaty palms, and it was really difficult, but we were received very warmly, and that made it easier. And so, yet it's still a challenge to do so. But in my case, it was about 2 weeks after my 13th birthday that my mother took her life. Different from Rick's situation, my mother had attempted suicide several times before. In fact, I was told it dated back almost to the age that I was then. And I had witnessed the aftermath of 2 of those attempts, and that had great impact on me. But I will always remember the day that my father took my sister and I aside to tell us what had happened. And my father never used the word suicide. He used vague references to things that had happened in the past. And so at first, I thought something else had happened. But fortunately, at the time, we were living with an aunt and uncle. And my uncle turned out to be the only person who was willing to be completely open and honest in answering my questions. And so for the several days that followed before the funeral, I stayed by my uncle's side, and he answered every question as candidly as he could. And when he didn't know the answers, he'd tell me that as well. And that made such a difference from then onward.
Well, that's the hard thing, is to find somebody in a family that will tell you the truth. And we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit more as we go through this interview today. So Rick, how about you tell us a little bit about your experience in losing your mom?
Well, I was 14 years old when my mom took her life. We were living in Kettering, Ohio, outside of Dayton. We had no family around us, no extended family, and really didn't have any close friends there. As David said, unlike with his mother, my mother had never attempted suicide. And as far as I knew, she wasn't depressed. Of course, that's the environment I lived in. It's all I knew was what she was like and what our household was like. So it was quite a shock. And my dad, like David's, never used the word suicide and kind of moved on, at least outwardly moved on from the suicide. Within a year, he'd remarried. We wound up moving to Maryland, where David and I met a couple of years later. And the only one I had to talk to really was my sister, who was 5 years younger than me. And so there was limited value there in talking to my sister. It was really important to both of us that we knew that we had someone, but she was very young at the time. So it was a real challenge. There was just no one around to talk to. And my dad didn't want to talk about it. And I'll tell you that with the perspective of a lifetime now, I can understand more why my dad didn't want to talk about it. The stigma of suicide, his own grief that he was suffering at the time, his concern for the children, his wondering what he was going to do next, any guilt he might have felt. So I've come to understand that much better over time.
Yeah, that's a really hard place to be, a teenager and then losing a parent and then having this shroud of silence. So I congratulate you guys. It took a lot of courage for you to come to that AAS conference. You had not been part of the suicide community prior to that, right?
That's correct.
And so you just jumped in with that book, and that was what it really amazed me, because I'd been around for a long time going to conferences, and I thought, wow, what courage to jump into something as serious as suicide when you weren't really part of the community before you wrote the book, and even as you wrote the book. So how about each of you talk about maybe about your search for answers over the years? Let's start with Rick, since we're already talking to you, Rick. Mm-hmm. How did you search and find the answers, since your father didn't really use the word? And did you even know what the word suicide was all about?
Well, I understand that suicide meant that someone was taking his or her own life. I didn't know a lot about it. I hadn't really been touched by suicide prior to my mother's death. I didn't feel a tremendous need to get answers. Of course, I always wondered why. Why would she take her own life? David and I have talked about this, and after we met, we talked quite a bit about, well, why did our mothers do that? How could they do that? And what we've come to learn, I think, over time is that's a question that you can never answer. But it's one that may be important to keep asking, just for our own well-being. But unlike David, wasn't really searching for a lot of answers. I did learn not long after her death, and I don't remember how I learned this, that my mother had left a note. So any sense that it might have been an accidental death kind of disappeared when I learned that. But to this day, my brother still thinks, well, maybe it was an accident. Maybe that wasn't intentional. And it's kind of his mechanism to deal with it. He's 4 years older than I am. So, David, you might want to talk a little bit about your search for some answers.
Yes.
Mine was a little bit more important to me. In fact, it probably still is to a large degree, but because I had witnessed the aftermath at least in two cases that I remember, one of which my father broke down the front door to our house because she had taken a bottle of pills. And I watched her wheeled out by the ambulance that night. And when I asked my father what had happened, he said, well, she was just very tired and didn't mean to take all the pills. And what was I then? Maybe 12, 11. And that's stuck with me. And for the moment, I accepted that, even though in the back of my mind, I knew that didn't add up. And so a number of situations like that were part of what drove me soon after she was successful with her suicide to want answers as to what was going on, because different adults were telling me different things, always, except for my uncle, sugarcoating and trying to do it, I know, with my best interest in mind. But at that point, since I had had to grow up much earlier in life because of the fractured home life, I really wanted answers. And for the longest time, I kept seeking them. In fact, I think it was maybe 6 or 9 months after her death, we were in New York City at the time. I got on the subway and went to the psychiatric hospital in Manhattan, where she had been for a couple of months before her suicide. And I, as much as I could at that age, I demanded to talk to her doctors. And I think for most of the day, they patted me on the head, let me sit there waiting and waiting. And finally, I think they realized I wasn't going to leave. So one of her doctors came out, and while I know he didn't give me much, he gave me something I always kept with me, which was my mother was unable to help herself, but apparently she was able to help many of the other patients that were near her. And that at the time didn't totally register with me, but in time I came to realize that that was maybe a way for her to deflect facing up to her own problems and unhappiness. She was able to help others, but she never was able to help herself.
You know, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that from you in our prior conversations, but it hits a common profile about people that do die by suicide, is that they're sensitive, caring people. They may have mental illness, they may be suffering from depression and so on. But part of the struggle is that they are super sensitive. So I could see why she would reach out to other people, because she understood their struggles as, you know, as much as, because they were in the same lane. We're in the same shoes of dealing with this. And underneath it all, she was a very caring person and was concerned about the people around her enough to sort of try to help and be that person for them. So that's another part of her. That super sensitivity is very common in people who die by suicide. Mm-hmm. They're very caring, loving people who have caring, loving families, just as you did. Mm-hmm. And then it's so true, so many times. So I think that's a really interesting thread of evidence that you have about who she really was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing. Yeah. So it sounds like the two of you only talked to each other once you met and found out that you had this common experience, and didn't really reach out to the rest of the community, your world or something. Just was very much of an intimate secret you had between the two of you. So
yeah, that's true. And at the time, this was more than 50 years ago, there wasn't a Friends for Survival. There wasn't an American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. There wasn't a National Alliance on Mental Illness. So some of those resources weren't available. And the ones that were, there were psychologists, not a lot who specialized in child and adolescent psychology, and even fewer who were equipped, trained to deal with a child who lost a parent, particularly a parent to suicide. And there was a stigma around that as well. The shrinks, the head doctors. Oh, it's kind of not really science. And so the combination of not having a lot of resources available and those resources that were available, having a stigma around them. You don't want to go to a psychologist. People think you're nuts. And
Rick, remember, our fathers didn't believe in seeking professional help either.
Yeah, part of it was, you got to just, go through it. Be stoic. Work this out. Be strong. Well, we discovered, actually somewhat by accident, that it's really helpful. Not only helpful, really important to be able to talk to somebody, to share those emotions and feelings.
So then let's talk about, so what was your biggest struggle, do you think, over the years? Was it the minimal exposure, the thing that you kept this kind of a secret within your own families and so on? Or was it just the lack of information that was out there? Because you're right. I never knew there was such a thing as a therapist when I was growing up. Never heard of it. And drugs were something of a prescription from the doctor. That's what I knew when I was growing up. That's as far as it went. So times have changed a lot. Yes. And I think, I'm sure our little town in North Dakota didn't even have a therapist. we wouldn't have known, we just got on with it, put one foot in front of the other and kept on moving. Yeah. And things have changed so much now that we do have more help. But It's got to be a real struggle in those days as a teenager, and just even as a young adult, starting your own families and so on. So how did that kind of work its way out over the years with your families and so on?
Well, I'd say the biggest struggle I had initially was just feeling like I was in a fog, like everything around me was moving either at slow motion, in super slow motion, or speeding by. And a month after my mother's suicide, President Kennedy was assassinated, which just kind of just hit me again. They're totally unrelated, obviously, but it was another big loss in a different way. But feeling alone was the biggest thing that I grappled with until, as we say, a cloudy, overcast March morning in Maryland, for me, 2.5 years later, when David and I met by accident. And shortly after that, we discovered that we had both lost a mother to suicide. And then there was someone to talk to, and someone who could identify, someone who was non-judgmental, who could be empathetic and listen openly and candidly. And being able to talk about it was critically important, as was being able to hear about it from someone else who had experienced the same type of thing.
Yeah, I think we shared that. For us, it became more of I think you mentioned it, Marilyn, a secret that we held away from everyone, and therefore it was all internalized, and we didn't realize what that was doing to us until, again, our chance meeting and the discovery that, my goodness, here's somebody just like me, and wow, now I could talk about it, and someone understood. They knew why I hadn't wanted to talk. They knew maybe we didn't understand it the way we do now, but then the feeling of relief. I can still remember the first conversation that we had when this eked out, and we looked at each other like this seemed impossible. And because we had so much else in common, both from New York City, we both moved around a lot as kids. We were both big baseball fans. And now we were both sons of suicide. And that was a revelation. And I was living with my aunt and uncle at the time. And I remember when I told her about Rick and the first conversation that we had, she started crying because she obviously understood at that moment what Rick and I didn't really come to understand until a few years later, what we had found in one another. And that's why we can't get rid of each other now.
You're stuck with each other. Isn't that wonderful? So looking back, I wanted to sort of have each of you share, how did the death of your mom and the lack of conversation, or in your father's, each of your father's inability to be open about it, which is really understandable in those days, very, very understandable. How that affected, how did it affect your families then and through the years, and even now with, you've got adult children, your grandfathers probably. I can understand it. And one of the things about the fathers is, and it's still true today, that many people blame the spouse. And so back in those days, the dads would have been looked at as having done something wrong, abused the wife, or wasn't taking care of her and let her struggle and not help her or whatever. They weren't the protective dad that they had been trained to be, and husband and everything, and be responsible for everything. So I can understand it, but it's still happening in this day and age. Also, spouses are still being blamed a lot by in-laws or by other relatives, and saying, why didn't you let us know? We could have helped. I mean, the variety of, I've heard some really nightmarish stories from people of the same kind of blaming, the blaming game. So, but how did this work in your own families, and growing up and having your own families and your own children, grandchildren? So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my maternal grandmother blamed my father for my mother's death. And within a couple of years, she essentially cut off all contact, not only with my father, but with his 3 children. And so I lost the whole side of my family. And it was compounded tragedy as a result. And my sister, who has tried a number of times to reestablish some relationship with our aunts, my mother had 2 sisters, has, just when it seems like something might happen, like they might talk to her, they stop. They just can't do it because their mother had said to my aunts, well, sometimes people die and a whole family dies in an auto accident. And that's how she kind of rationalized cutting off the relationship with my dad and my brother and my sister and me. So,
oh, wow. That had to be hard.
Yeah, it was hard. And as I said, we had no extended family around us. My both sets of grandparents lived in New York City, and we were in Ohio, and we saw them typically maybe a couple times a year, and that was it. So we had nobody around us. And then to have, even when we moved closer, when we moved to Maryland, to have that side of the family was gone. So it was very sad.
Yeah, and David, what about you? What happened in your family at the time?
Well, it was very, very similar, Marilyn, to Rick's case. My mother's mother and her only sister blamed my father for everything. And they were not shy about saying that to my sister and I every time we visited them. And it got to a point in the Jewish religion, the gravestone goes up a year after the death. And as it turned out, because of the way my grandmother felt about my father, she took responsibility for putting up the gravestone. And when I came to the cemetery and looked at it, it said, beloved, every association except wife. And when I saw that, I started just running out of the cemetery. I was so upset. An uncle came and got me and talked me into coming back, but it now was etched in stone, literally and figuratively, that I could never get away from it. And while it's been many years since I've been to her stone, every time I go, I have the same memory dredged up again, and how it was. And like with Rick, it really created great tensions. While I didn't lose that side of my family, it was never the same with that side of my family.
Mm. That's really hard when it's etched in concrete.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So what about the years now that you've created your own families and your own, and your lives of, careers? A whole lot has happened in the last 50 years.
I think it's evidence that there can be really fulfilling life after the suicide of a loved one. We never forget about our mothers. I remember when I hit my 30th birthday, and I realized I'd lived twice as long without my mother as I had with her. And when I hit my 40th birthday, I realized I'd now lived longer than my mother had. So there are times like that that I remember the loss, the great loss. But, and certainly when David and I worked on the book, which took us about 7 years to write, we were remembering things, memories, some good ones and some not good ones, about our mothers, and certainly good ones, positive ones about our friendship, and it's the way it really had medicinal value. It helped us heal to be able to talk to each other candidly. But when we started writing the book, it was the real intent initially was just to share the story with our family, mostly our children, our wives who we talked to about it, but mostly our children and some other close family and friends. But when they read an early manuscript, our wives said, you have something here that's worth sharing. I remember Karen, David's wife, saying, wouldn't this have been helpful to you, in a few years after you'd lost your mother? And so we said, okay, maybe we even have some responsibility here to share this more broadly. And we did. And Marilyn, you mentioned meeting us at the AAS conference in 2019. It was the month the book was published, and it was our first speaking engagement. And I will tell you that meeting you, the reception we got in general, was so encouraging, so positive. But meeting you and having you talk to us afterwards was really, really encouraging, and told us we were on the right track. And we've talked about that a number of times since, and really appreciate that. But David, you might want to talk a little bit about your son, Jeffrey, and his reaction to the book.
Yeah, the book writing process was for us a revisiting of so much, and a learning of so much that we didn't know or had forgotten or never really knew in the first place. But it also brought with it some revelations. When we had a final manuscript of the book, we decided we needed to share it with our children and let them know what we were doing. And I sent it to my son, who's 45 years old at the time. I was in Arkansas then, And he read it overnight. I learned the next morning through an email that he sent Rick and I, thanking us for doing the book, and that thanking each of us for finding one another. But then he said to me, this was all new to him. And, oh, was I taken aback? I had no idea that I had never talked to him about it. He knew the basics, but I asked him, why didn't you bring it up to me? And he said, I always sensed how painful it was, and I never wanted to add to that. And that really, really touched me. And I realized that my daughter had asked me more questions, so it wasn't quite as new to her. But to my son, again, being a male, he just held it in. And subsequently, when we next visited, we spent a few hours together and remedied that to an extent. But I still carry a little guilt about all of that. Yet, I think at the same time, it was one of a number of discoveries. One other one was that for a number of years, I realized I could not remember the sound of my mother's voice, and I had no place to go to hear it. And I know I had said that to Rick before, but when I brought it up after the book, he began to realize the same thing, right?
Yeah.
That neither one of us could remember that. And somehow, again, the friendship made that a little bit easier to take. And it was one of a number of things that we learned in the process of doing the book. One last one I'll note is that because the sons in this case were us primarily, but we later in life learned that two other good friends of ours had lost a parent to suicide. And they are part of the book process. And the four of us have only been together once for a weekend in Chicago. And during that weekend, we all opened up in ways we hadn't before. And as a result of that, we all came to realize that with age and perspective, we'd all come to forgive our parents in ways we hadn't for many, many years after they chose to take their own lives.
Well, the story is amazing, and it is really the story about your friendship and how valuable it is to have somebody to talk to. So let's talk about a little bit what you have learned about sharing, and now that you're out in the public arena, so to speak, with the book, what have you learned about sharing and the value of it?
One thing that has happened is that we have heard from a lot of people who have been touched by suicide or sometimes other kinds of traumatic loss. And it's astounding. There's a lot of commonality. There are also significant differences in what happened, how old they were at the time, whether it was a close relative or just someone that they knew, but it really hit them hard. There are a lot of numbers out there, and we sometimes quote them. There's 48,000 suicides in a year in the United States, and each one touches in some way of 135 people on average. So that adds up to 6.5 million or something like that every year in the United States. And those are big numbers, but what really gets to us, I think, are the personal stories. When we were just finishing our book, my wife Helen and I were at a dinner party, and there were three other couples, and we were standing around beforehand, the four guys, one of whom used to be a client of mine. And he said, well, Rick, since you retired, what have you been doing? And I explained a few things, more time with the family, traveling a little bit, involvement in some nonprofit groups. And I mentioned the book, and they asked, what's the book about? And I briefly explained it. And one of the guys said, well, that's quite a coincidence, because my father took his life when I think he was 21 at the time. And our host said, well, Rick, I'll bet you when your book is published, people will come out of the woodwork with their stories. At the end of the evening, I was the last one to leave. And our host was walking me to the door, and he said, you know how I told you that people would come out of the woodwork? I said, yeah. He said, well, I'm one of them. My mother took her life when I was 18. Now, here we were at a dinner party with 4 guys, and 3 of us were sons of suicide. I mean, it was just astounding. And he had only talked with his wife about it. He's never talked with his adult daughter about it, although she knows. But now he and I have talked a number of times, and I hope that's helpful to him. But we've heard stories like that from people we've known, and from people we've only met because of this book, and the op-ed pieces we've written, and the interviews we've done on television, radio, and programs like this, that webinars and so on. So if what we have done can help someone somewhere a little bit to heal, to know that they're not alone, to remove some of the stigma, to raise awareness, then I think we're pretty happy about that.
Yeah, right.
Opening up sounds like a very simple and easy thing to do with something like a suicide, yet it's neither. And we've come across that with so many others. But the process of doing it is a release like I can't even describe. The relief that we each felt when we first shared the secret. I think we still feel today. But what we've learned additionally is that the process of saying out loud what you'd only kept inside is a form of acknowledgement. It makes it real. It releases the secret, and maybe reduces the burden that you feel you're sharing it with someone else. And in our case, we were able to talk to the other one about our own situation. So it wasn't just one of us, it was both of us. And then later on, we had 2 others. And interestingly, Tom, one of the other 2, who we both knew very well for 20 years before it accidentally slipped out one day when we were on a baseball road trip together, that he had lost his father to suicide. And we were all kind of stunned. But regarding Tom, when our book was finished and his wife read the book, she wrote Rick and I a really moving letter thanking us for doing the book, because she had always wondered, she knew that Tom had lost his father to suicide, but she always wondered when Tom was sad or a little depressed, what was wrong. And when she would ask him, he would say, well, I'm just kind of tired. And she always knew he wasn't just tired, but she didn't know more. Now she did, because he wrote about his own situation in the book in ways he hadn't been able to talk about. And for them, it opened up conversation that was 50 years overdue.
Yeah, I'd say if there's one key message that we try to get across through the book and our speaking engagements and so on, it's to talk to someone. It's to open up. Don't let all of that fester inside your head. It's like a pressure cooker. And if you can talk to somebody, it releases, instead of having that torment inside you, you release it. And that can be just enormously helpful along the way.
And while we talked with each other about it very frequently the first few years of our life, it's now become an occasional thing, at least until we worked on the book, which stretched over 7 years. But it opened up new vistas for us to explore and share and examine. And it continues to make the difference. And now that we've met folks like you, Marilyn, and others in this field, that feeling of being a part of a community of survivors just accentuates the feelings that we found with one another when we started this journey.
Well, you really have done some fabulous things. The thing is that if you know, in the old days, having cancer was considered shameful, and we wouldn't talk about even cancer, especially breast cancer. And now we do that regularly. It's just part of life anymore. Mm-hmm. And your books will contribute to the fact that this helps eliminate some of the stigma and the shame that people have, because people die by cancer, people die by heart failure, they die by other things, and they die by suicide. And when we get to the point where we can not look on this as being a shameful thing and more of a physical illness, which is what people have by the time they do this, because this is not an easy thing to do. Killing yourself is a very, very difficult thing to do. But that isn't who they are. You know, they had a life. You had those years with your mom. And how they died is not the sum total of their life. Not at all. But it's hard for other people to see that, you know, because it seems to just cloud over this big black cloud over their lives. But that's not really the truth of it all. So you want to share with us maybe a few great, unusual opportunities you've had nationally, probably, and of course, if you get online, then it's internationally, but some special things that have happened to you because of the book?
Well, this is certainly one of them. So thank you. Yeah, we have written 2 op-ed essays, one that appeared in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, I live in Cleveland, and one that appeared in the San Diego paper, where David lives near San Diego. I was honored to do a keynote address for an organization here in Ohio called Life Act. And it helps young people to identify in themselves and their peers emotional issues and an attempt to eliminate some suicides. And they've been very successful. It's a really wonderful organization. And then most recently, we did a TEDx program for TEDx University of UC Irvine, I guess. And it will be on YouTube in a few weeks, I think. So we're thrilled to be able to do that. We've done some programs for some other organizations as well.
Well, I am hoping that being on this webinar with Friends for Survival is going to project you and, you know, shoot you way out there, that you're going to end up being even having more things to do. But, you know, it takes a lot of courage to write this book. I know you did it for your families, but to put it out there publicly, it's courageous, but it also makes such a difference in our community of survivors. If more people was willing to ask for help, which we get 30 to 40 families a month, new families that call us every single month. So We know the numbers, but it's only because we've been here a long time doing this, 38 years. So
thank you for doing that. What a wonderful thing to do. And we are personifications of the value of what your organization is named. We're Friends for Survival. So
yes, we are.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I know Susan introduced you, but I know Susan's been on this call for this webinar all the time too, and she's been very, very quiet. Susan, is there any comments or anything you want to make before we close this webinar?
No, I just enjoy really hearing your stories. It helps with my healing. You know, we all walk this together. We're in different places, but hearing every little tiny word and tidbit just helps healing.
good.
It really does. So in our organization, in order to be involved in our organization, you need to have been affected by a suicide death. And that doesn't mean necessarily it's family. It can be a friend. It can be a neighbor. It can be also just lots of other different things. It can be a student, a coworker. But being affected by a suicide is a big deal. But the great thing about your book now that you've opened up to your families and you know, aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, is that you've documented this part of your heritage, which is really, really important for people to know their heritage and some of the struggles. We can have compassion for the struggles they had, but we also can admire the courage that they had over the years. And to get through it all. And so it's a very positive thing. Actually, it is really positive because life is not just all about mountaintops. Life is about ups and downs, and there's a few valleys, and sometimes there's some deep pits we have to go through. But we still, we still do it, don't we? We still made it. And your mothers would be proud of you boys. I call you the boys, by the way. Your mothers would be very, very, very proud of you boys. I really mean that. And your family should be very proud too of your courage to open up and do that. People our age don't always open up to things like this. They haven't in the past. But as we do this, we're going to make a big, huge difference. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your journey with us, and more importantly, giving us insight into the pitfalls of withholding and denying the truth of a suicide death. There are pitfalls for that. And it's important that we do open up and don't let it destroy our lives, because your moms didn't want their deaths to destroy your lives. You know, they loved you dearly, but their own personal struggle was just too much. And we're all vulnerable. We all have hard times from time to time. Pretty hard to get through life 40 or 50 years without something that's a little difficult for us. So we applaud your courage and your willingness to actively join our community of survivors of suicide loss. So thank you so much, David and Rick. Those of you watching this webinar, feel free to reach out to Friends for Survival. We will be having more information in our newsletters coming up, so please tune in. And there is hope, there is peace, and there is reconciliation in all of these experiences. And we thank you so much for sharing today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And please always think of us as the boys.
Good boys.
Thank you.
Thank you.